She was 32 and dismissed in front of 40 men. The buyer's clerk laughed once and wrote nothing down. She had no wages anyone meant to pay, no letter of character, no husband, and no company in Cornwall that would hire her again. She had one thing worth keeping, a smooth white block of dried clay, stamped 1872, wrapped in brown paper, with her dead father's pencil mark across the fold. For £11 and 9 shillings in back wages, Gideon Voss signed over a dead clay works at the head of the valley, with broken tanks, a stopped wheel, and a chimney 2 years cold. But what Voss did not know was that behind the third settling tank, where the channel narrowed under a run of fresh sawn boards, there was something that had no business being there, and finding it would change not only what Jane Trevorrow was worth, but what the whole valley shipped. If you were ever told a thing was finished when you knew better, tell me below. The rejection happened on a Tuesday, the 12th of October, in the dispatch yard at Ruddle Bridge, with rain coming in off the sea and soaking the barrel staves black. 42 tons of dried china clay stood on the wharf in casks and stacked blocks, waiting for the coasting boat, and Edward Harcourt had come down from Stoke-on-Trent himself to see it loaded. He was 44, heavy in the shoulder, and did not talk much while he worked. He took a block off the third stack, snapped it across his knee, and rubbed the broken face with his thumb. Jane watched him do it and knew before he spoke. He wet the piece in a bucket of rainwater, worked it between his fingers, then held his hand up so the men nearest could see the gray shine on his skin. "There is sand through this," he said. Gideon Voss came across the yard without hurrying, because he was a manager who never hurried. He was 47, clean-shaven, with a good gray coat, and the sort of voice that made a refusal sound like arithmetic. He agreed that the sample was poor, and said it was a great pity, and that the Carne Venn ground had been going off for 2 years, and that any man who knew Cornish clay knew a deposit could run dirty at the end, the way a well runs muddy. Then he turned and said that the batch intervals had been kept by the tally clerk. Jane said the intervals were kept exactly as he had ordered them, and that she could recite them by date. Voss said that would not be necessary, and told her, in front of the loaders and the boatmen and Harcourt's own clerk, that her services were no longer wanted. Somebody near the crane laughed. Jane went to the counting shed, took her ledger book, and did not take anything else that belonged to the company. But she put 4 pieces of the rejected clay in her apron pocket, each one wrapped in paper, each one marked in pencil with the tank it had come from and the day it was drawn. Jane Trevorrow had learned the trade in the order a person learns it when nobody is paying for her schooling, with her hands first, her back second, and her head last of all. She had gone into the dries at 9 as a clay girl, carrying dried blocks into the linhay and scraping the dirty skin off them with a curved knife until her knuckles cracked in winter. At 16, she was packing barrels. At 26, a manager found she could hold a column of figures in her head and check it against the weighbridge without writing anything down, and she went into the counting shed at 11 shillings a week, 3 shillings more than she had ever earned, bent over a barrel. Her father had worked 41 years in the same trade and had never once been asked his opinion by a man in a good coat. Charles Trevorrow could put his hand into a launder and tell you what the water was carrying. He had given her the block of 1872 on the day she started in the counting shed, wrapped in the paper he had marked, and he had said one thing about it. "Water does the work, Jane," he said. "All we do is give it the time." She unwrapped that block on the kitchen table in her mother's house at Trevorrow that night, with the rain going sideways past the window, and her mother, Grace Trevorrow, 59 and short of breath since the spring, asleep in the chair by the range. The old block was white, the way a plate is white. She broke a corner off it and rubbed it wet between her fingers and felt nothing at all, only a slick like soap. Then she did the same with a piece from the rejected shipment. It scratched. Under the lamp, the wet smear on her thumb had little points of light in it, mica and fine sand, the sort of thing that ruins a teacup and tears a paper machine's felt to pieces. Both had come out of the same ground, and she was certain of it, because she had written the tally cards herself, and the Carne Venn slurry and the Penhale slurry both came off the same broad decomposed granite under the Ruddle Valley, from tanks fed by the same water. She thought about the summer, when Voss had come into the counting shed twice a week with the same instruction. Shorten the intervals. Draw the tanks at 11 days instead of the schedule. He had not shouted about it, only said the company had an order to fill and that the old timings were habit rather than rule. And she had written down what he told her to write down, because clerks write what they are given. That night she did something her father used to do when the men argued about a batch. She got 6 glass jars out of the pantry, the kind her mother put damsons in, and she filled each one with water and a spoonful of clay, 1 jar for each sample, and she wrote the tank number and the date on a strip of paper gummed to the glass. She stirred them with a wooden spoon until the water went the color of milk. Then she put them on the windowsill and went to bed. In the morning, the jar from the rejected shipment had gone into layers. At the bottom lay a band of coarse sand, a quarter of an inch deep, glittering where the light caught it. Above that sat a thinner gray line of mica. And above that, 4 clear inches of clay, settled soft and white as the day her father cut his block. The company settled with her 11 days later, in the office at Penhale, with the land agent present because the sum was owed against a lease. Richard Carveth was 55, a careful man with ink on the side of his hand, who sat at the end of the table with the schedule book open and said as little as he could. Voss made the offer pleasantly. The company could pay her £11 and 9 shillings in installments of 5 shillings a week, beginning in the new year, subject to the state of trade. Or, if she preferred, the company would assign to her the remaining lease and the plant of the Carne Venn China Clay Works, which had stood idle since the spring, and consider the wages discharged in full that afternoon. He said it as though he were doing her a kindness that embarrassed him. Jane asked Carveth what came with the lease, and he turned the schedule around so she could read it and went through it with the end of his pen. 14 years remaining on the term. The pan kiln, the linhay, the tanks, the launders, the wheel and the pump. A right to take water from the Ruddlelet, measured, not more than the works had historically drawn, the gate to be kept in repair by the tenant. A right-of-way for loaded wagons over the tramway from the works down to the wharf sidings at Ruddle Bridge, at the tenant's cost of maintenance. She read that page twice and asked whether the water and tramway clauses ran with the lease or with the company, and Carveth said they ran with the lease. Voss said, mildly, that it hardly mattered, since there was nothing left at Carne Venn worth carting. Jane took the works. She signed, Carveth witnessed it, and Voss shook her hand at the door and said he hoped she would not find the winter too hard. She walked out owing nobody anything, and owning a property that had lost the company £400 in its last 12 months. Nessa Polmere was waiting at the gate because she had heard what was being offered and did not believe it. Nessa was 39, widowed 6 years, senior packer at Penhale, and the only person in the valley who could look at a drying floor and say which end would be ready first. She had a way of putting an objection that did not leave room for a soft answer. "Broken tanks don't pay wages, Jane," she said. Jane said she knew that, and Nessa said she plainly did not, or she would have taken the 5 shillings a week and gone into service at St. Austell like a sensible woman, and then walked with her all the way to Tregarrick anyway, listing what was wrong with the place. Jane went up the valley alone the next morning, the 15th of October, with her father's block in her bag and the 4 wrapped samples in 1 clean jar. The track climbed for 1.25 miles beside the Leat, and the last quarter of it was under water where the channel had broken its bank. She came round the shoulder of the hill, and there it was, terraced into the wet side of the valley, the long granite building of the pan kiln with slates gone off the roof in 2 places, the chimney standing up black and cold above it, the open-fronted linhay with its post-crusted pail, 4 rectangular tanks cut into the ground above the dry, and below them a small overshot wheel standing still in its pit with the water going round it instead of over it. Nothing on the property was moving except a pair of jackdaws on the chimney head. Before she went through the gate, she stood a minute and asked herself the question she would go on asking for the next 5 months. If the ground under this valley was finished, why was her father's block, cut out of that same ground, still whiter than anything the company had shipped that year? If you have a guess already, put it in the comments, because a good many people in the valley got it wrong for a long time, and Jane got it wrong twice herself before she got it right. She got it wrong the first time about 4 minutes after she walked in. She started at the tanks, because the tanks were where the money either happened or did not. There were 4 of them, cut into the slope and lined with mortared stone, the largest 30 feet by 14. Number 1 held 2 feet of black water with a dead sheep's worth of smell coming off it, and number 2 was cracked down the west wall, a crack she could get 3 fingers into. Number 3 was half full of set clay gone hard as chalk. Number 4 had a rotted drawgate and a wooden marker post standing in the corner, and the post was what stopped her. Every tank at every work she had ever known carried marks on the post or on the wall, cut or chalked, showing the level and the day. The post in number 4 had a run of chalk marks up the side in a hand she recognized, because she had seen that hand on requisition slips for 6 years. The marks were dated, and the dates did not agree with anything she had written in the batch book. She stood with her hand flat on the wet post and went through it. Her ledger said Tank 4 had been drawn on the 9th of March, and the post said the 17th of February. Her ledger said Tank 3 ran 19 days, and the post said 9. She copied every mark into the back of her own book before the rain could take them off, and she did not tell anybody what she had copied. Thomas Hendra came up the track that afternoon because Nessa had told him she was there. He was 57, had been a launder carpenter and millwright at Carne Venn for 22 years, before the company put him off, and his right shoulder had never set true after a gate fell on it in 1881. He walked the tanks with her, then the launders, then went straight to the wheel pit, and she understood within 10 minutes that he had already decided what was wrong before he arrived. The wheel was an overshot, 12 feet across, with 9 paddles gone or split and the shaft bedded in silt. The flat rods that carried the drive across to the slurry pump had a broken link, and the pump plunger was seized in its barrel. Thomas said the whole valley's trouble came out of that pit. "Get the wheel true and the pump steady," he said, "and you get an even flow, and an even flow gives you an even product, and everything else is talk." Jane did not argue with him because she wanted him, and he was the only man living who knew where every board in that place had been laid. She walked the launders herself, up from the sand traps to the head of the works. Most of it was what she expected. Boards warped and sprung, gray with old clay, half of them wanting nails. But at the head of the second run, where a gate stood in the channel to send the water one way or the other, the ironwork was not right. The gate hung on strap hinges, and the straps were bright along the bearing edge, worn shiny the way iron goes when it has been swung a great many times lately. Everything within 20 feet of it was rusted to a scale. That one gate was not. She put her hand on it and worked it up and down twice and felt how smooth it ran. Then she looked at where it sent the water and could not see because the channel beyond it went under a run of boards laid flat and disappeared. She wrote it in her book, 3 lines, and went back to the wheel pit because there was no money in the world for 2 theories at once. They made a list that evening in the linhay with a stub of pencil, and the list was short because she had 11 pounds 9 shillings in wages she had never received and 13 pounds 2 shillings of her own saved out of 6 years in the counting shed. Clear the leat, clear the tail race, rebuild the wheel, free the pump, make 1 tank hold water. Nothing else until those 5 things were done. The leat took 9 days. It ran 1.25 miles from the intake above Carne Venn and had silted and slumped and grown a crop of rushes thick enough to walk on. Jane paid 2 men from Trevorrow 8 pence a day and their dinner to cut and shovel with her, and by the 4th day her hands had split across the palms and she bound them with rag and kept going. The tail race was worse, packed solid with white sand to within a foot of the top, and they dug it out 2 barrow loads at a time, 340 loads by her count. Thomas cut 9 new paddles out of elm at the Sawyers in Ruddlebridge, 3 shillings and 6 pence for the timber, and could not lift them into place because of the shoulder, so Jane held them while he set the wedges. He was uneasy about that for a week, and called her the clerk when he talked about her to other men, and asked her twice whether she would not be better keeping the book at home in the dry. Nessa arrived on the second Monday with 4 packers behind her. "You will want people who can find the place in the dark," she said. Nessa had asked them herself, and told them plainly there was no wage until there was a sale, and 3 came anyway because Nessa was going. They were Elsie Hicks, 44, Amos Kello, 68, who had burnt kilns since he was 15 and could tell by the smell of a flue when the fire was drawing wrong, and Jory Penhale, 24, no packer at all, but a tramway brakeman put off when the sidings closed, who came because he was angry and had nothing else to do with it. Jane set up the way she meant to go on before anything ran. Wooden markers were cut and driven into every tank, notched at the foot, the half, and the full. She ruled batch cards out of a penny quire of paper, 1 to a batch, with the date the slurry went in, the date the tank was drawn, the hours the wheel had turned, the coal burnt and the weight out, and hung them on nails on the linhay wall where anybody could read them. Amos said he had worked at 4 dries and never seen a card a workman was allowed to touch. They finished the pump linkage on the 6th of November, with a new link Thomas had made at the Smiths at Ruddlebridge for 4 shillings and 2 pence, and when it was set, Jane went up and lifted the sluice at the head. The water came down the leat with a noise like a crowd, hit the wheel, and the wheel stood a moment and then began to turn. The flat rods took up, the pump knocked twice and started to breathe, and slurry came out of the pit at the pump head into the launder and ran down the boards past the sand trap, thin and gray-white, moving as it ought to move. The 2 men from Trevorrow cheered. Elsie Hicks put her hand in the launder and let it run over her fingers and laughed at herself for doing it. Jane filled a jar from the tail of the launder, where the slurry entered the tank, marked it, and set it on the ledge in the counting corner of the linhay. She left it 2 days, which was longer than she had left the jars at her mother's window. When she came to it on the 8th of November, there was clay above, and there was clean water above that. But under the clay, plain as print, lay the same 1/4 inch of glittering grit. She should have stopped there and asked why. Instead, she counted her money. She had £6 11 shillings left, a mother who needed coal, and 4 people working for her on a promise. Harcourt's company took small trial parcels from unproven works, 2 tons at a time, and paid on acceptance. 2 tons at 42 shillings would be £4 4 shillings, which was 6 weeks of breathing. She wrote to Stoke on the 9th of November and offered a 2-ton trial for the first week of December, and she told Thomas the flow was right now, and the flow had been the fault. They cleaned number 1 and number 4 and left number 3 with the old set clay in it, because breaking that out would have taken a fortnight they did not have. She ran slurry into number 4 and let it stand 22 days, which was as long as she dared and not long enough. And she knew it when she drew it, because the clay came off the gate wetter than it should have been. She spread it 6 inches thick, where 4 would have been right, because 6 inches looked to her like the difference between a sail and no sail. Amos fired the furnace. The hot gas went through the flues under the floor, and by the 3rd day the surface was crusting. On the 4th he came to find her with soot on his sleeve, and said the fire was pulling wrong at the north end, and she looked and saw nothing but a floor drying unevenly, which she put down to the thickness. She had also, without thinking hard about it, opened the drawgate between number 3 and number 4 to give herself more standing room for the second half of the batch. Number 3 had 30 years of old settled sediment in its bottom under that set clay, and the water going through it lifted the top of that sediment and carried it quietly into her clean tank. They cut the batch on the 28th of November, 2 tons and 100 weight, and stacked it in the linhay, and Nessa scraped and turned it and said nothing much, which was how Jane knew. Harcourt did not come himself. He sent his assistant, Arthur Sneath, 26, who arrived on the 2nd of December in a coat too good for the linhay floor, took 11 blocks from different parts of the stack, broke each one, wetted each one, and rubbed each one out on the flat of his hand. 2 were clean, 4 were gritty. 5 had gray flecking through them from the north end of the floor that Jane, when she looked at it properly under the window light, knew was furnace ash and not mineral at all. "We cannot use this," he said. He was civil about it, and he was on the 4 train, and the batch stood in the linhay unsold. It had cost her 3 tons and a half of coal at 14 shillings the ton, and 9 days of the 2 Trevorrow men, and the last of the elm. She had £4 3 shillings in the tin. She told them the next morning, all of them, standing in the linhay with the failed blocks behind her. She said she had wanted a sail before Christmas and had drawn the tank early to get one, and that she had done the same thing to her own works that had been done at Penhale in the summer, and that she would not do it again. Amos went and put his head into the flue eye at the north end with a lamp, and came out and said there was a crack in the crown of the number 2 flue you could put a shilling through, and that the ash was walking straight up into her clay. Thomas took a different lesson from it. He said if it was only the flue, then their flow was right, and Jane said no, and took him to the ledge and stood him in front of the jar. The wheel was true now. The pump was steady, and the grit had never once left that jar. Then she said the thing that turned the winner. "It gets worse when the gate at the head is open," she said. They mapped it in the 2nd week of December, in weather that never once got properly light. Jane pinned a sheet of packing paper to a board and walked every channel on the property with a pencil and a 10-foot rod, and Thomas walked with her and named things. She drew the intake, the leat, the sluice, the wheel pit, the pump, the rising launder, the sand trap, the open launder along the terrace, the gate with the bright hinge straps, and the tanks, and then laid the board on the barrel head in the linhay and looked at the shape of it. The water came into the works, dropped its coarse sand in the trap, ran 200 feet along the terrace, and went into the tanks. That was the whole route. 200 feet. Thomas looked at it for a long while, with his thumb on the paper. "That is not how it went when I was here," he said. He said that in his time the slurry left the sand trap and turned north along the hillside into a long shallow run, boarded flat and near level, that went out 300 feet to the turn by the spoil bank and came back, and they had called it the Long Drag, and it was where the mica was dropped. A man could stand on the boards at the far end and see the fine glitter lying on the bottom like frost, and they had shoveled it out twice a year. It took the water the best part of an hour to get down it, and the hour was the point. Jane asked where it started. He said behind the 3rd tank, where the channel narrowed. They went out with 2 lamps at 4:30, in the dark. Behind number 3, the ground had been let go, and under brambles up to her waist, where the channel mouth should have been, stood a wall of boards nailed flat across the opening and packed behind with rubble and clay to the height of a man's chest. Jane pulled a board off with a wrecking bar. The nails came out bright. Not one of them had a scale of rust on it. The sawn ends of the boards, where they had been cut to length, were still yellow inside, and when she put her thumbnail across the grain, it was hard and clean, not the soft gray fur that 6 or 7 winters put on cut timber in that valley. Thomas held the lamp close and said the saw marks were a circular saw, and that Carne Venn had never owned one, and the sawyer at Ruddlebridge had put his in 3 years ago. Behind the boarding, the old channel ran away north into the dark, silted but there, running out towards the spoil bank exactly as he had described it. Then they went back to the gate with the bright straps, and Jane understood what she had been looking at in October. The gate did not choose between 2 ways of getting to the same place. The gate closed the mouth of the long drag and sent the whole flow down a shortcut that somebody had opened straight along the terrace, 200 feet of new boards instead of 600 feet of old ones, saving the water 50 minutes and saving the company nothing at all except time on paper. She sat up that night at the kitchen table at Trevorrow with 3 things in front of her: her own batch book, the chalk marks she had copied off the tank posts in October, and the wheel logs she had found rolled in the counting corner, which recorded the hours the wheel had turned each week, because the lease measured her water by it. She laid them side by side and worked through the whole of the previous year. The company's dispatch weights for June, July, and August showed more dried clay leaving Carne Venn than the tank posts could have held in the days the post said the tanks were standing. A tank of that size, filled and drawn in 9 days, could not give up the tonnage the book claimed, because the clay in it would still have been half water when it went on the floor, and half water is half weight and twice the coal. The coal bills proved the rest. Voss had burnt 1/3 more coal per ton in July than her father's dispatch record showed for the same tank in 1872, which is precisely what a man burns when he is drying soup instead of clay. He had not run out of good ground. He had cut 50 minutes out of the water's work, drawn his tanks a week early to make his tonnage look right, spread it thick and wet, burnt coal to hide it, and written the dates to fit. And then he had stood in a wharf yard in the rain and said the deposit was dirty, and let a room full of men hear him blame the tally clerk who had written the dates he gave her. Jane sat back and did the other sum, the one that mattered more: 600 feet of drag to dig out and reboard, timber at 9 pence the foot, nails, gates, labor, and the flue crown to rebuild before any of it was worth anything. She counted the tin twice: 4 pounds 3 shillings in February and March to live through before a single ton could be sold. She got the money the way people in that valley got money, in small pieces from people who could not spare it. Her mother sold the mahogany chest that had come from her own mother for 2 pounds 15, and Nessa put in 1 pound. Thomas would take nothing for his work after Christmas, and Jane wrote what he was owed in the back of the book anyway, at 2 shillings a day, so that it existed. Bettany Rouse, 48, who kept the shop at Trevorrow and never came near the works in her life, let Jane have flour and bacon on the slate until March and told her not to make a speech about it. They opened the long drag over Christmas and into January, in 5 weeks of weather that came in off the Atlantic and did not stop. Digging silt out of a boarded channel is work with no cleverness in it. They took out the rotten boards and burned them, cut the bramble to the root, dug the run down to its bed and laid new boards. And Jane learned in 3 days that she could not do that and keep the book and see the buyers and mind the fire. So she stopped trying. She gave the channel to Thomas, the whole of it, and told him she would ask him for the length done each night and nothing else. She gave the drying floor and the linhay to Nessa. She gave the tramway and the 2 broken wagons to Jory, who spent 9 days relaying 40 yards of rail on the incline with sleepers, cut out of the old launder timber, and who came to her at the end of it filthy and pleased and asked her to come and look, which she did. They reopened the mica drag on the 20th of January. They rehung the head gate so the flow went the long way round again and put a peg through it so it could not be swung by accident. Amos rebuilt the crown of the No. 2 flue with fire brick brought up on the tram, 31 bricks at 5 pence each, and Jane took the roof slate off the linhay's dry end to patch the 2 holes in the kiln roof over the north floor, because she could not buy slate that month. Then she ran it slowly, and she ran it marked. Every batch got a card. Every tank got its post read at 7 in the morning and at 5 at night, and the levels written in Nessa's hand or Elsie's, not always in hers. She kept No. 1 for the long-settled material and No. 4 for the second draw and would not let them be joined. She took a jar off the tail of the long drag every day and stood it on the ledge in a row, and the row of jars became the thing people looked at when they came in out of the wet. The jars changed. In the last week of January, there was a fine gray band in the bottom of every one. By the middle of February, it was a line you could barely see. By the 25th of February, the water came off the drag with nothing in it at all after standing a night, and the clay above it was the color of a bone china cup. They drew number 1 on the 1st of March, after 39 days standing, and it came off the gate thick as porridge. Nessa spread it 4 inches on the floor and took 2 days over the spreading. It dried even from end to end. They cut it into blocks on the 6th, and Jane weighed every barrow, and it came to 6 tons and 300 weight of clay so smooth that Elsie kept picking blocks up to feel them. Jane sent 1 block and 1 jar to Stoke, and she sent something else with them. Amos knew the brickyard at Ruddle Bridge, and they made up a little slab of the clay, dried it and fired it in the brickyard's kiln, and it came out white and true with no black specks in it anywhere. Harcourt wrote back on the 12th of March. He did not congratulate her. He said the sample was good, that one sample was one sample, and that he would come himself and would want to see consecutive batches, the tanks they came from, and the record of both. The letter was worth having, and it did not solve her problem. And Jane worked out why on the back of a batch card the same evening. Harcourt's works could take 6 tons in March and perhaps 8 in May, and he would pay well for it, 46 shillings the ton for material of that class. 6 tons a month would not keep 12 people. The tanks in the floor and the fire cost the same whether she made 6 tons or 30, and the drag now delivered far more clean suspension than her 1 premium tank could hold. The second draw was the difficulty. The clay out of tank 4, after the fines had been taken off the top of tank 1, was clean and pale but a little coarser to the finger, and it would never be a teacup. She had 4 tons of it in the linhay and no notion what to do with it. Alias Bell came up the track on the 15th of March because Jane had written to 3 paper mills in Bristol in February on the chance of it, and one factor had answered. He was 51, thin, in a wet hat, and he had spent 30 years buying filler for paper machines and had a way of examining clay that she liked at once, because it was all done with his hands in a jar. He stirred a spoonful of the second draw clay into water, let it stand while he drank his tea, and looked at what came down. He rubbed the wet clay on the back of a sheet of his own mill's paper, and then rubbed the paper between finger and thumb, listening to it. He held a dried piece up to the window to judge the color against a sheet he carried folded in his pocketbook. "This will not make you a cup," he said. "It will make me paper, if it is the same next month as it is today." He explained what would ruin him and what would not. A little coarseness he did not mind. Gritty minded absolutely, because it cut the felts and scored the rolls and cost him more in a week than the clay was worth in a year. And color he minded, because a gray filler made a gray sheet no printer would take. Clean and pale and regular, month after month. And he would take 18 tons of it. Jane understood that afternoon that she was not running 1 works but 2, and that the whole thing turned on never letting them touch. She reorganized the works over the week that followed. Tank 1 in the tail of the drag were the pottery line, drawn long, spread thin, cut and stacked at the west end of the linhay under a whitewashed board with the batch number on it. Tank 4 was the paper line, drawn on its own schedule, stacked at the east end under its own board. 2 sets of cards, 2 sets of scales, tickets. Different colored chalk on the barrows, white for pottery and blue for paper, which was Nessa's idea and worth more than most of Jane's. They took on 12 in all. Jane wrote the wage list on the linhay wall where the cards hung. Packers 11 shillings a week, drying floor 12, Thomas 18 as millwright, Jory 14 on the tram, paid Saturday at noon, and the sums from which the wages came written up beside them so that anyone could see what had been sold and what had been spent. Amos said no dry in Cornwall did that. Jane said this one did, and left the board where it was. Voss came back into it the way a manager does, which is by letter and by other people. Walter Bray, 52, the coal merchant at Ruddle Bridge who had carried Jane on credit since November, wrote on the 18th of March to say that he could no longer supply the works except for cash on delivery. He was decent enough to add, in the same hand, that he was sorry and that Penhale took 90 tons a month off him and had asked him a question about his terms. 2 days later, the haulier who had agreed to take her wagons off the sidings found that the sidings had been reassigned. Then the water went down. Jory found it first, on the 21st, when the wheel slowed at 11 in the morning and did not pick up. They walked the leat to the intake and found the upper gate wound half down and pegged. It was on Penhale land, and Penhale had wound it. Jory took the wrecking bar off the barrow, and Jane put her hand flat on his chest and stood there in the rain until he swore and threw the bar into the grass. She told him, once, that if they broke that gate they would be trespassers and thieves in the schedule book, and that she intended to be the only person in the valley who could not be described that way. Voss came up himself on the 23rd, on horseback, and looked at the linhay and the wage board and the row of jars, and he was perfectly pleasant. He said the trade was harder than she remembered, that a small works could not carry a bad month, and that Penhale would take the lease off her hands for £80 and find places for 4 of her people. He said it in front of Nessa, which was a mistake, because Nessa laughed at him. Jane said no, and thanked him for coming up in the wet. That night she went through the lease schedule again, line by line, at the kitchen table. It was there, in the plain, dull language such things are written in. The tenant of Carne Venn had the right to draw from the Ruddle-leet a measured quantity, calculated on the hours the works wheel turned, which was why the wheel log existed at all and why her father had kept one every week of his working life. The gate at the intake was to be maintained but not obstructed, and any party obstructing it was answerable to the lessor. The tramway easement ran with the lease for loaded wagons at all reasonable hours. She copied both clauses out, took them to Carveth at St. Austell on the 24th, and asked whether the schedule said what she thought it said. He read it, and read her copy of the wheel log, and said that it did, and that he had witnessed the assignment himself and would say so to anybody who asked. The gate at the intake was wound back up on the 26th. Nobody said who had done it. On the 27th, 2 letters came within an hour of each other. Harcourt would be at Carne Venn on the 31st, with fired trials of the March sample. Bell would come the same day, since he did not care to come down twice, and would bring his own paper and his own jars. Carveth wrote to say he had been asked to attend as well. He had been asked by Voss. And Voss, that week, was at Penhale with the Carne Venn batch books of 1886 open on his desk, making a fair copy of the summer's schedule in a clean hand. It rained for 30 hours before the inspection, hard enough to take the surface off the track, and at 4 in the morning on the 30th, the leat came over its bank above the sand trap and drove a sprungboard out of the rising launder. Jory hammered on Jane's mother's door at 5:30 to tell her that dirty water was running down the terrace and into the head of the drag with hillside grit in it. Jane went up and tried to run all of it herself. She was in the launder with a plank when she should have been at the tanks, and she sent Elsie for nails, and then shouted after her to bring the shovel instead, and for 20 minutes there were 8 people on that hillside doing 4 jobs badly. Nessa took her by the sleeve and walked her 10 feet away from the noise. "You cannot be in 3 places," she said. "Say who has what, and then let them have it." Jane stood in the rain and did the hardest piece of work of that entire winter, which was to stop touching things. She gave Thomas the breech and the launder. She gave Nessa the tanks and the draw gates. She gave Jory the flooded track and the tram, because the wagons had to run whatever else happened. Then she went and did the one job that was hers, which was to close the gate at the head of the drag and shut the dirty water out of the clean system altogether, and to stand there with the peg in her hand while everything upstream of her filled and spilled and made a mess she would spend a week clearing. Thomas had the board back in and caulked with sacking and clay by 9. Nessa had the pottery tank sealed and its post read and the level written before the water level moved a 1/4 inch. Jory had a wagon on the incline by 10 with the first 3 tons of the pottery batch on it, tarpaulined, because he said that a wagon standing loaded at the top of a wet incline was a wagon nobody could argue about later. The rain eased before noon. By 4 o'clock the drag was running clear again, and the row of jars on the ledge had a fresh one at the end of it, marked the 30th of March, standing beside the 29th and the 28th, and every day back to the 10th. They swept the linhay floor that evening, all of them, and put the boards up straight over the 2 stacks, and Amos banked the furnace low so the floor would hold its heat overnight. Voss arrived at 10 the next morning with a leather case under his arm, a 1/4 of an hour before either buyer, which Jane had expected. He walked the linhay before anyone else got there, looked at the wage board and the batch cards on their nails, and said nothing about either. Harcourt came up with a wooden box, and in it were 4 fired pieces made from the sample she had sent, a cup handle, 2 flat tiles and a small saucer, white and true, with the glaze sitting even on them. He set them out along the barrel head so everybody could look, then asked to see the stack the sample came from, and Nessa took him to it and let him choose his own blocks, 11 of them, from top, middle, and bottom. Bell worked at the other end with his jars, stirring, standing, rubbing his wet clay onto the paper he had brought and running his thumb across it. He asked for the second draw stack and did it all again with that. Voss said what he had come to say while both men were still working. Any dry in Cornwall could produce one fortunate batch, he said. The ground was worked out, and Miss Trevorrow had picked her best material to show them and could not repeat it. He opened his case and laid out a fair copy of the summer schedule, settling times and dispatch weights, and said the figures answered for the ground and not for the process. Jane put 3 things on the barrel head beside his book. The first was the row of jars, 21 of them, one for every day from the 10th of March to the 30th, each labeled and sealed with wax, each with the same clean band of clay and the same clear water above it, and the failed December jar at the end of the row with its glitter in the bottom. The second was her batch cards, in 4 hands, with the tank posts read morning and evening, and the third was the wheel log and the dispatch weights. Then she went through his own numbers with him, slowly, so that the men standing round could follow it. She showed that his book had tank 4 standing 9 days in July, and the chalk marks she had copied off the post in October, in his own hand, saying the same. Then she showed the weight he had dispatched from that tank and asked Harcourt what water a clay carried after 9 days in a tank of that size. And Harcourt, who bought 30,000 tons a year, answered plainly enough for everyone. Then she showed the coal. 1/3 more coal burnt per ton in July than the works had burnt for the same tank in her father's time, which is what it cost to dry water instead of clay. Thomas took Harcourt and Bell and Carveth out behind the 3rd tank and showed them the boarded channel mouth, the bright nails in his palm, the yellow sawn ends, and the circular saw marks, and told them what the long drag had been and when it had been buried, and Carveth wrote it down. Carveth also said, without being asked, that the water in the tramway ran with the lease, that he had witnessed the assignment, and that he would have something to say to Penhale about the intake gate. Harcourt closed his box and took 6 tons at 46 shillings on condition of monthly sampling. Bell wrote out 18 tons a month at 16 shillings and 6pence, first delivery in April, terms 30 days, and signed it on the barrelhead with Nessa's pencil. Voss put his book back in its case. He did not confess to anything, and nobody asked him to. He stood by the linhay post while Jory took the brake off, and the first loaded wagon went down the incline towards the sidings, and then he got on his horse and rode down the track after it. She paid the wages that Saturday at noon in the linhay, out of the tin, with the book open on the barrelhead and the sums chalked on the board beside the batch cards, and every one of the 12 could see what had come in and what had gone out and what was left. Elsie Hicks counted hers twice and put it in her boot. Amos Kello said it was the first Saturday in 11 years he had known what he was worth on paper. The stacks stood at their 2 ends of the linhay under the whitewashed boards, pottery west, paper east, white chalk and blue, and by summer the works was sending out between 25 and 30 saleable tons in a month. Jane took 1 block off the March stack, a clean one, and cut her initials into the flat of it with a knife. She carried it home and set it on the kitchen shelf beside her father's block from 1872, and the 2 of them stood there, the same white, from the same ground, 41 years of a man's knowledge and 1 winter of his daughter's. Water does the work, he had told her, and all we do is give it the time. It had taken her until March to understand that he had not only meant the water. Below the house, the wheel was turning, and the loaded wagons were going down to the sidings.